Tantor Audio presents FDR and the Jews by Richard Breitman and Allan J. Lichtman. Narrated by Todd, McLaren. Introduction. 4 Roosevelts. During World War II, the Nazis and their collaborators shot, gassed, starved, and worked to death some 6 million Jewish men, women, and children in order to destroy the biological substance of the Jews. They perpetrated what remains to date the only systematic effort by a modern state to exterminate an entire people across all national frontiers. Upon gaining power in 1933, Adolf Hitler and other leading Nazis targeted for persecution alleged blood enemies of the German race. Yet before the war, Nazi oppression of German Jews followed a jagged trajectory. Some Nazi activists physically assaulted Jews in the early, exuberant days of Hitler's semi-legal revolution. Once secure in their authority, Nazi officials curbed personal violence, but enacted a series of discriminatory laws and decrees, what contemporary observers called Hitler's cold pogrom against Jews. Only in late 1938 did central authorities instigate the violence known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, wiping out synagogues across the country in a matter of days. For the first time, the Gestapo imprisoned tens of thousands of German Jews in concentration camps that also held other alleged enemies of Hitler's new Reich. Some scholars have condemned Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States from 1933 to 1945, for callously standing by while Hitler persecuted German Jewry and then exterminated nearly 2/3 of Europe's Jews. Playwrights, filmmakers, and political figures have replayed this story of ironic betrayal by a famously humane president whom Jews of his time revered. Others claim that Roosevelt did everything feasible to rescue European Jews and saved millions of potential victims by orchestrating the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. The titles alone of prominent works illustrate the two extremes that have dominated debates about FDR and the Jews. Critics wrote, "The Abandonment of the Jews," and "The Jews Were Expendable." Defenders countered with "The Myth of Rescue," and "Saving the Jews." This ongoing quarrel is unforgiving, passionate, and politically charged. Conservative backers of modern-day Israel hold FDR out as an exemplar of indifference to Jewish peril and the horror of genocide. The survival of Israel, they claim, depends upon avoiding his errors. Liberals, in turn, defend their iconic president from what they see as unfounded smears. Our work challenges both extremes in this dispute. We seek to capture the contemporary reality of FDR and other leaders, whose decisions were constrained by the past and projected into what the poet Longfellow called the shadowy future. For most of his presidency, Roosevelt did little to aid the imperiled Jews of Germany and Europe. He put other policy priorities well ahead of saving Jews and deferred to fears of an anti-Semitic backlash at home. He worried that measures to assist European Jews might endanger his political coalition at home, and then a wartime alliance abroad. FDR usually avoided singling out the Jews in public. When he engaged Jewish issues, he maneuvered, often behind the scenes. When he hesitated, other American officials with far less sympathy for Jews set or carried out policies. Still, at times Roosevelt acted decisively to rescue Jews, often withstanding contrary pressures from the American public, Congress, and his own State Department. Oddly enough, he did more for the Jews than any other world figure, even if his efforts seem deficient in retrospect. He was a far better president for Jews than any of his political adversaries would have been. Roosevelt defied most Republican opponents and some isolationist Democrats to lead political and military opposition to Nazi Germany's plans for expansion and world domination. As biographer Kenneth Davis has noted, Roosevelt could turn empathy on or off at will, as if it were water in a faucet. FDR believed that he must act like a physician who must daily operate in life and death situations, and simply could not afford to let himself feel too acutely the pain of those who suffered. Doing so would impair his professional performance. Like a triage physician, FDR gave urgent attention to some priorities at times in his presidency, while putting others aside. The most dramatic accusations against FDR, his unwillingness to admit to American soil the Jewish refugees aboard the SS St. Louis in 1939, and to order the bombing of gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, do not withstand close scrutiny. His critics have given them emblematic moral weight. We have restored their actual historical significance. Roosevelt went through 4 different phases on Jewish issues as the conditions of his presidency radically changed. Only during his first term was he a bystander to Nazi persecution. FDR refused to jeopardize his political future or his large agenda in domestic and foreign policy by rubbing raw the wounds of ethnic antagonism in the United States at a time of massive economic suffering. Much like Lincoln facing the political need to hold the Union together while wrestling with a humanitarian imperative to abolish slavery, a first-term president put political realism above criticism of Nazi Germany and efforts to admit persecuted Jews into the United States. He declined to meet with Jewish leaders until shortly before the 1936 election. After his re-election had released some political pressure and Hitler grew bolder in his cruelty, a second Roosevelt shifted course and ministered to Jewish concerns. This now activist Roosevelt used his executive powers to loosen immigration restrictions and to promote his own ambitious plans to resettle the Jews of Europe in other lands. He publicly backed a Jewish homeland in Palestine and pressured the British to keep Palestine open to Jewish immigrants. FDR's activism diminished during 1939, especially after Hitler provoked the European war by invading Poland in September. A third Roosevelt put internal security, foreign policy, and military concerns well above Jewish issues. FDR sought to insulate the homeland from foreign spies and saboteurs and overcome domestic resistance to revising America's restrictive neutrality acts and aiding nations resisting Hitler's aggression by all means short of war. He feared that undue attention to the Jewish question would benefit his isolationist adversaries and stymie his foreign policies. America's entrance into the war created intense pressures for a swift and decisive victory. It generated new fears about enemy subversion within the United States and once more diverted attention from Nazi atrocities against Jews. Diplomatic and military officials worried about appearing to fight a war for the Jews and insisted that America could save the Jews only by defeating Hitler's armies. In late 1943, a fourth Roosevelt changed direction again and addressed Jewish issues with revived interest. He established a war refugee board to help rescue the surviving Jews of Europe and pursued plans for the post-war resettlement of refugees. Shortly before his death, a gravely ill president met personally with the influential king of Saudi Arabia in an effort to secure a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Roosevelt also denounced organized anti-Semitism as an integral part of Hitler's brutal attempt to rule Europe and the Western world. Any American who condoned or participated in anti-Semitism was playing Hitler's game, he said in February 1944. There is no place in the lives or thoughts of true Americans for anti-Semitism. FDR's record on Jewish issues would look better to the 21st century if he had spoken out this forthrightly years earlier and acted decisively on the consequences of his words. Still, Roosevelt's initiatives to aid imperiled Jews after his first re-election, and in the late stages of the war, were not empty gestures. Even his failed proposal in
Sample complete. Ready to continue?